Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are just getting started. I hope you are all having a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us at this very busy time on campus and in the end of the year. I'm going to do a quick introduction and then we'll get to the meat of the event today. My name is Constance McBarron and I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead for EarthLab. And before I introduce you to our co-hosts, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I live and work, where numerous tribal communities have lived since time immemorial. I acknowledge and honor the past, present, and future Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. From wherever you are joining us here today, I encourage you to learn more about the land you are on. And if you are in North America, a good resource to visit is www.native-land.ca. So we know land acknowledgements are important to say, but they must be followed up by meaningful action. And that is why I'm proud to join you today representing EarthLab, an organization that is dedicated to pushing boundaries. Sorry, just lost my place. Committed to pushing boundaries to develop innovative, just, and equitable solutions to environmental challenges with a focus on issues at the intersection of climate change and social justice. So EarthLab's Executive Director, Ben Packard, is here today as one of our event co-hosts, and he will be moderating our panel discussion. But now I would like to introduce you to our next co-host. We'll be introducing you to our panelists. Jeffrey Riedinger is the Vice Provost of the UW Office of Global Affairs, leading the administrative responsibility for the university's diverse global programming, which includes support for international research, study abroad, student and faculty exchanges, and overseas centers. And he also serves on the faculty of the University of Washington School of Law and the Sustainable Development LLM program. So Jeff, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Constance. As Vice Provost of Global Affairs at the University of Washington, I am privileged to lead the UW Office of Global Affairs, or OGA. Our vision at OGA is to educate and engage across borders and divisions to advance equity, opportunity, and a sense of shared responsibility for our world. And we are excited to be partnering with EarthLab for today's event. OGA manages the UW status as an observer organization to the Conference of the Parties, or COP, the governing body for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As a research and independent non-governmental organization, or RINGO, the UW is able to participate in COP events alongside other academic and scientific institutions that research and identify the causes and consequences of global climate change. OGA is looking forward to working closely with our campus partners to encourage more faculty, staff, and students to engage with the COP process. I encourage you to reach out to OGA with ideas about how we can collaborate. We have here with us today the 3 UW representatives at COP26, and I'm happy to have the honor of introducing these distinguished scholars. Dr. Maya Tolstoy is the incoming Maggie Walker Dean of the College of the Environment. Most recently, she's been a professor at Columbia University's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Incoming Dean Tolstoy is a marine geophysicist specializing in seafloor earthquakes and volcanoes. She has led 18 research expeditions at sea as chief or co-chief scientist and has 66 peer-reviewed scientific publications, including 10 in the journals Science or Nature. She recently served as the interim executive vice president and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia, a role in which she oversaw 5 schools with more than 3,000 faculty and staff and 11,000 full-time students across 28 departments. So Maya, I'm hoping that the College of Environment's a little less formidable in terms of the size of the enterprise, but certainly not in terms of the scope of the enterprise. Dr. Deb Morrison is a learning scientist working in areas of climate and anti-oppression design-based research. The goal of her work is to foster science-informed, justice-centered leadership specifically in climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience efforts. Dr. Morrison earned a BS in geography at the University of Victoria, an MS in plant sciences and environmental sciences at the University of Western Ontario, and a PhD in science education at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Dr. Kristie Ebi is professor at the UW Center for Health and Global Environment. An epidemiologist, she has been conducting research and practice on the health risks of climate variability and change for 25 years. She's been focusing on understanding sources of vulnerability, estimating current and future health risks of climate change, designing adaptation policies and measures to reduce risks in multi-stressor environments, and estimating the health co-benefits of mitigation policies. She has supported multiple countries in Central America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific in assessing their vulnerabilities and implementing adaptation policies and programs. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ben Packard, who will be facilitating today's conversation. Take it away, Ben.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to you and your team for co-hosting this conversation together. As Constance mentioned, I'm the executive director here at EarthLab, and I'm honored to moderate this panel discussion. Convening conversations is one of the many things that EarthLab does to bring us together across campus and to connect us with community partners. So thank you all for joining us. I'm grateful to our panelists, Maya, Chris, and Deb, for taking the time today to share your reflections about the COP26 conference and experience and how we, as individuals here at the university, may take meaningful action to continue to move these issues forward. To start, we're going to ask each panelist to talk for about 5 minutes or so, sharing your initial thoughts about your experience at the conference. And then we'll jump into a Q&A and we'll welcome questions from the chat. This is really meant to be a discussion. We have this incredible opportunity to learn from the experiences of our panelists, and we're going to get going. Maya, you're right next to me. So would you mind kicking us off here?
Sure. Okay, I'm happy to. And I'm probably the right one to give the simplest introduction because this was my first COP, and I really didn't have an official role, unlike our other two panelists, beyond as an observer. And I really went there to learn, and learn I did. And I think the first thing that really struck me about it is how extraordinarily disorganized it was. Right from like trying to get into the meeting with the hour-long line in security in the Glasgow weather, up to the almost complete absence of a meaningful agenda. And so there was no really substantive agenda given ahead of time, and they'd mail you a sort of agenda the morning of. And so it was really hard to even figure out what was going on. I'm enormously grateful to Deb in particular, who helped me find my way in the meeting and gave me some insider tips on how to find out what was going on, particularly through RINGO. But so it was very interesting. I learned a lot. It was incredibly moving, actually, because of the profoundness and magnitude of the problem that they were grappling with, or that we were grappling with. I was surprised that it led to a really complex set of emotions that really covered the full spectrum, from utter despair to real hope. And I'll probably start with despair because I'm an optimist, and I'd like to end with hope. But the despair really came from a sense that there was just an enormous amount of greenwashing going on. And as Greta Thunberg said so eloquently, a lot of blah, 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 and just, really vast quantities of that. And also a profound lack of appreciation of the sense of urgency. All this discussion of 2050 and 2030. And I was just like, oh my God, that's a long way away. And then, I can give more specific examples of that later, but then on the flip side, I think just the fact that they felt the need to do this greenwashing gave me a sense of hope. I think there is an increasing sense that the politicians and the people in positions of power to sort of influence these policies, as well as industries, major industries, really are starting to get that this is real. They're starting to feel the pressure from protesters, from young people in particular. And so, the fact that there was all this greenwashing going on was a sort of progress of sorts, because they felt the need to pretend to do something, even if they weren't going home and not quite doing as much as you'd hope. And then the youth always give me hope, and the youth protest was amazing. And again, people like Greta, Vanessa Nakate, who's just brilliant and eloquent as well. And there's many youth speakers who were really inspiring. There were a lot of inspiring talks, panelists, press conferences from Indigenous groups that were very moving, very powerful. At the same time that we're being told they weren't really being given a voice at the table. But that was also inspiring. The increasing recognition of the importance of environmental justice, I feel like that was hopeful, even though again, the actual action on it less clear. And then even though the governments are not really stepping up, at least certainly the major polluters are not really stepping up in the way that we need them to, with the urgency that we need them to. There's so much action going on at the smaller scale, at the local scale, and in the US, at the state level. And so we're so lucky in Washington with our governor that he's so proactive on these issues, and California is proactive on these issues. And so that sort of gives you hope. And but it really brings me home to the importance of the work being done at UW, and particular at the College of the Environment, and the sort of fundamental research that's so critical to understanding the Earth systems, but all the way to EarthLab and the amazing work done there, and the solutions-based work that's so desperately, urgently needed. And so it's really exciting to be joining you guys at this time, and there's really nothing more important, I think, happening in the world right now than this kind of work. So I'll finish with that.
Great. We're a little biased to agree with you there, but thanks so much for sharing that, Maya. Chris, would you share your reflections, please?
Sure. And Maya, I've been to many COPs. The first COP I was at virtually. And a good colleague who's been to all of them likes to say, it's your first COP, you're a tourist. And it really helps that perspective of trying to understand the amazing complexity of that event. And I'll do a little bit of kind of organizational comments. So it is the annual meeting of the Conference of the Parties, and parties are government. When there is a UN agreement, and there's lots of UN agreements, the World Health Organization, FAO, and others, then countries can sign on to those as a government, and they're called a party. And that's why it's the Conference of the Parties. There are 3 categories of people who can attend, and you have to come in on a delegation. It's not open to the general public. And you can come in on one of 3 delegations. You can come in as a delegate, and you have different colored badges, by the way, and the badges tell you a lot. And I've been fortunate to be on delegations for countries, and that lets you go into the negotiating sessions themselves. And so the negotiators have long experience. And it is important to keep in mind that these people are trained negotiators. And there is no question that they understand the challenges that are being faced. All of the agreements are by consensus. Everybody has to sign on. You don't have dissenting opinions. And it is really challenging in that situation. To illustrate the seriousness, a couple of years ago on a COP, it was 2 o'clock in the morning for a particular delegation. And they had to call and wake up their prime minister to ask if it was okay to sign off on something. The countries take this really, really seriously. For all of the challenges with the COP, I like to remind people, they all show up. There's fundamental disagreements across the countries, and they all come. And that really speaks to their dedication in trying to move forward. And talking with the negotiators, that each country comes in with critical issues that they need to address, and working together in different combinations to try and move that forward. None of them are ever satisfied with the outcome of a COP. All of them recognize more needs to be done. All of them are deeply knowledgeable about climate change. So they understand that we may miss something this year and we're going to have to pick it up next year. The negotiations go on all year long. The COP is a culmination of 12 months of negotiations on issues. So that is the core of the COP. The second kind of badge you can have, which I've also been able to get over the years, is you can come in as a UN organization. And for example, the UNFCCC Secretariat or the World Health Organization, FAO, and others, you can get badges from these organizations, which allow you to go in and watch the negotiations. And so those are the two groups of people who can go into the negotiations. Around that is civil society. And that's part of what the University of Washington is. And you get to go and watch this amazing circus. If you think this COP was disorganized, there's been some really impressively disorganized COPs. There was a COP in Copenhagen. The lines to get in were 7 hours long. There was all kinds of snow on the ground. I had to go get somebody out of line because they were giving a presentation, sort of a high-level person for the IPCC. Some of these have been just absolutely awful. One of the problems in Copenhagen is the night before the COP, the fire marshal came in and looked at all the arrangements, and they had given badges to many more people than the fire marshal would allow into the building. And that turned into, if you have questions, it was just quite an event. So you have these different groups and they have different roles and different responsibilities. Negotiators to negotiate, UN to try and facilitate these. UNFCCC Secretariat has a central role in those negotiations and moving them forward. And then civil society is there to push forward on all different kinds of agendas. And one of the biggest delegations to the COP this year was from oil and gas industry. And they came in very strongly to push their particular perspectives. But they're not the only ones. That when you go around the side events, there's all these different perspectives. And there are now large demonstrations outside the COP as well, because you have to be on a delegation to get in. So you get a sense of the chaos of the circus that goes on. In terms of the negotiations, everybody focuses on how far the ball has been pushed on mitigation. And that's one of many negotiating pillars. Adaptation, critically important. Agreements were reached on adaptation. There were discussions on the global goal of adaptation. It's going to be a very important process next year in Sharm el-Sheikh. So they did reach agreements that are going to be important for the adaptation. I personally don't follow RED, the deforestation, reforestation issues. I understand advances were made in terms of RED. And then there's always issues around financial flows. And there was a very strong theme across this COP about the financial flows. Back in Copenhagen, where it was particularly chaotic, there was an agreement amongst the high income countries that by 2020, there would be $100 billion of new money every year on adaptation and mitigation. And the countries have not come close to achieving that. And some countries, including our own, did not contribute to that at all for many years, started recently to contribute. But a lot of what we do is kind of repurposing of, well, we're already giving money for this and we're just going to label this as a contribution from the US, which creates the kinds of challenges you can imagine. Anyway, that's sort of a rambling introduction to what these kinds of events look like. I participated in a whole bunch of events at various hours of the day and night and middle of the night, and really good attendance and really high interest in a range of issues. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Deb, can you share your reflections, please?
Yes, so a couple additions to how Kristie laid things out, I think that I would add. One is that there are various constituent bodies and organizational clusters of work to add to what she's saying. And the parties that we're talking about are for entry into the blue zone, so badges into the blue zone. There's also a green zone where there's a lot of community organizations, day tickets, civil society and community members can also enter in. And there's a significant amount of work. And you might have heard many things on the media about some of the events organized by community partners, things like some of the marches with the youth organizations involved and others. And those are very much part of the COP activity, though they are not part of the formal conference of parties inside the space. The green zone is actually a formal structure as well. So inside the constituent bodies, I'll speak to what I participated in and the sort of way that works. So RINGO, so University of Washington is a RINGO representative. That's research, informal, non-governmental organization, research and independent non-governmental organizations. And so every morning there's a RINGO get together, what's going on, who's presenting, and we share. And then we can think about if we want to attend each other's events or what might be important. And during that moment, you can ask for badges into particular negotiation sessions. So as a RINGO representative, you can go into negotiation rooms and sit and you're not allowed to represent RINGO per se, because that's not how RINGO works, but you can sit in on those negotiations in the RINGO seat. So that's very helpful. And I did that several times in the ACE negotiations, which is the Action for Climate Empowerment. I'll come back to that in a second. There's also things like the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, which runs a lot of different workshops and was a constituted body under the Paris Agreement. And it's Article 11, I think it is, under the Paris Agreement, and it provides learning and professional development and sharing and capacity building broadly across the world. It's been doing that virtually and has historically done a lot of things virtually through webinars. But we were very honored to, I was asked to co-host one of the entire days for the Capacity Hub at the UN. And so I facilitated that, and it was wonderful and awesome, and had a situation where different networks, things for like the APEN Asian Network, Indigenous folks across Northern Africa, people from around the Amazon and the Himalayas, all came and presented work on how they're building capacity across the world. One of our, Madame Malouk, from the Honorable Madame Malouk from Africa, came in and just spoke everything in French, and nobody except me in the room happened to speak French. So that was lucky. And so was able to translate and facilitate that process. And then we were given a half an hour to summarize the day. So I summarized and have a recording of the summary across the day of events of how capacity building looks across the world. So that was fabulous. Another body in the UN is the LCIPP, a constituency, and that's the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Constituency. I sit as an official observer as UW, as a representative on that. I am the RINGO observer on that committee, and I applied to RINGO. So through the RINGO network, they ask who would like to sit on these different committees, and I asked to be the official observer. I used to be the official observer on that for what's called ECOS, which is a UN community. It's education, communication, outreach. But I decided to also ask as the RINGO to give up my ECOS seat to somebody else. So, and that community, so lots of acronyms, I apologize, I would have put them in the chat, but I don't seem to be able to access the chat. So LCIPP is the Local Community Indigenous Peoples Platform. It's run by half state party members, so nations, representatives from nations, and half Indigenous community representatives from around the world. It has a 8-person council, I think it is, 8-person council. And currently the chairs are Hindu Ibrahim from Chad and Thomas Cameron from Canada. And so I know Thomas, I'm Canadian, and not that all Canadians know each other, just FYI, but happen to know Thomas in small circles. And so it was really wonderful actually to participate in that listen. It was 3 days prior to the main events of COP. So I went for 2.5 weeks in total to Glasgow, a couple of days just to get my feet under me for the time zone difference. And then 3 days for the LCIPP meetings. And then the main work that I did while I was there was two-pronged. One was to work on the ACE negotiations, something called the Doha Work Program, which had been in place for 10 years to implement Article 12 of the Paris Agreement and Article 6 of the Convention, which is around education, communication, public awareness, public access to information, public participation and international cooperation around those. Basically, it's everything to mobilize climate action is how I think about it. And all of those pieces were being renegotiated, and what is now called the Glasgow Work Program for ACE, the Glasgow ACE Work Program, is now in play. We were able to talk with, so we had a team of about 20 people from organizations all across the world, civil society organizations that were working in conjunction in long-term relationships with partners, negotiators, government negotiators across the world. So we were able to influence various pieces of that. Didn't get everything we wanted, but we're happy with what did happen because of what Kristie was talking about with the consensus issues. We didn't get human rights woven into ACE, which was frustrating. But there are still, various UN agreements that already speak to that. And so we will just continue to reference them adjacent to each other. And finally, I guess the last piece, which is where my hope is, I like to end on hope too, is that we spent significant amount of time in informal conversations in some of the exhibit spaces presenting and in US and international exhibit hall spaces in conversations with justice folks all over the world to basically lift the idea of knowledge alone about climate change is not enough. We know this from social science and communications research. So how do we engage storytelling and link knowledge with relevance for needs with the environmental justice movement globally and within the US? And how do we use networks to move that work in all different ways possible? And we were quite successful in doing that. So I will pause there and let's continue on with the conversation, but I'll throw some things in on that in a bit.
Great. Thank you all. What a fascinating combination of experiences and reflections. We're going to move now to open Q&A. Unfortunately, the chat function doesn't seem to want to work today. And what we'll do is ask folks to use the raise hand function, and I'll try and keep track of that order. But I thought I might see if we can have a little speed round of a question to kick us off. And that is that there's been a lot of talk about what did or didn't happen. And I'm curious what each of you thinks is the most important outcome. If you had to pick one thing, what was the most important outcome of the whole COP26 in your personal opinion? And I'll leave it to whoever wants to jump in first here. And then again, a reminder to our guests for joining us that if you have questions, line up with the raised hand function if you can.
So thanks, Ben, and I'm happy to start. And I can't pick one. If I'm going to pick one, it's the fact that all the countries continue to show up and continue to negotiate. And progress was made in some places, not much progress was made in others, but there is a commitment to an ongoing engagement, recognizing the importance of the issue and commitment to these ongoing negotiations. There's midterm negotiations in June. There's lots of informal negotiations between now and June, and then between June and Sharm el-Sheikh. So that continued engagement and commitment to trying to find common ground so that the advances they understand that they need can be made.
Great. Thanks, Chris, for getting us going.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anywhere near as sophisticated an understanding of it as Chris does, but I also was impressed with this idea that they were meeting again to renegotiate sooner and after a year rather than 2 years. And that, as much as I was saying they don't appreciate the urgency of it, there is some sense of urgency there, and that's very encouraging. That's hopeful, and I think it's starting. We always, I think, if you really understand the magnitude of the problem, the way someone in earth science might, you always want it to be faster, but there is a momentum there, which is really encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. One of the things that COP does is it allows governments and organizations to take a moment and announce things in very formal ways where recognition is centered on them. And we see a lot of that. New York Times Climate Action Hub was there. lots of places where people can have the world stage. And so one of the things that I agree, I don't think I can pick a single one, but I'm going to name one anyway, was that the US government, in collaboration with the UK, Germany, Norway, Netherlands, announced a $1.7 billion funding pledge to between now and 2030 to protect for Indigenous communities, with the recognition of their role in protection of forests and biodiversity. And that is a really critical thing that is woven into a lot of work that's been going on. And the fact that the president of COP attended the LCIPP meeting, like he came and sat and spoke at the LCIPP meeting, and the president of the General Assembly came and sat and talked with the LCIPP. That is actually very new. And it's a recognition that Indigenous peoples, while they may not have nationhood inside the COP system the way that it is currently established, they are in fact important in decision-making and public policy critically.
Great. Yeah, I've listened into some other post-COP discussions, and I was struck by how many people remarked on who, similar to Chris, had attended many of them, had remarked that the voices of Indigenous people, women, and youth were much more present and elevated in the discussions and in the events. I don't see anybody with their hand up yet, so I'm going to ask Jeff, do you have any questions you'd like to ask right now? I have a few more ready in case you don't. But
there are two hands up.
They're actually Muindi and Ali have.
Oh, great. Great. I can't see that for some reason. Muindi, why don't you get us going?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this I'm going to give a bit of a preceding question and a follow-up. So half of my family comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the other half is from Tanzania. But if you're ignoring those political borders, I come from the region of the Rift Valley Lakes in kind of Central Eastern Africa. And I mention this distinction because between the political borders and the ecology and landscape, because I find it difficult to conceive of how political borders which determine involvement of parties are well suited to determine distributions of resources for adaptation and mitigation when it's the ecology or landscape that ought to guide those distributions. And so my question stemming from this is how that distinction between national borders and natural borders is felt at the COP events or even talked about. And I know that the presence of Indigenous peoples is probably very important in this regard, going back to what Deb said, but I just want to ask how they speak about that at COP, because I don't really find that talked about in the news very much.
Maybe I'll jump in on that one first. As an ecologist, I'm like totally feel you. And so my background in science is actually as a biogeochemist in forest ecology. And I actually think that that's a critical way that we're starting to reorganize up in the Pacific Northwest. We see that with the Salish Sea region and the biogeoregion that we occupy in the Salish Sea region that crosses Canadian, American, and First Nations and tribal nation borders. And really the management of it has to be across all these different levels of governments and organizations. We need to think new ways of organizing and thinking, and COP meetings really do help with that. They actually help us sit down in weird constellations that are probably logical constellations that are not political, historical, colonial in nature. And that can actually really help move things in important ways. One of the sessions in the Capacity Hub that was so amazing was this collection of people that put together an hour and a half of talks, and they were Amazonia, Himalaya, and I'm dropping the last one. It was somewhere across Africa, but it might have been Congo actually. And they were basically talking about this idea of biogeography and how it needs to guide us in our climate decision-making and adaptation efforts. And so I think the answer is that governments are struggling with that because of the way that they were constructed as nations, and civil society is well situated to help with that in different ways.
And if I could add to that as well, two different perspectives. One is that the high income countries come with 60, 80, 100 people. The least developed countries come with very few. And 15, 20 years ago, there was an effort to start training negotiators from the LDCs. And this process was funded by the UK. It used to be DFID, it's now FCDO. And every year at the COP for at least the last 15 years, all of the least developed countries would come the week before and they would have training sessions on how to negotiate together. Because there were so few of them from each country, they have a meeting every morning and they look at what's on the agenda for the day and they sit down, and this is really hard. Put yourself in the shoes of somebody from a country. You don't have enough people to go to all of the different negotiating sessions. And so you have to develop collaborations with other countries and say, I trust you enough to represent my issues. And would you go to this particular set of negotiations, and I'll go to these negotiations for you. And I've been in some of those meetings, and those kinds of discussions of this biogeography come up. And so they do have the discussions as they're preparing for the negotiating sessions. They are representing their country, but they're also representing other countries, because not all countries can be in each and every discussion. So it happens behind the scenes. We could talk about whether it's enough or not, but it does happen behind the scenes. The second way this comes through is that there's 4 adaptation funds under the UNFCCC. And for most of these funds, there are particular entities that are allowed to access the funds. They're accredited entities. And when you look at the proposals that come through these accredited entities, they often take a biogeography approach. They're multi-country, and they're saying we want to focus on the Rift Valley, or we want to focus on some other issue around small island developing states. And so that does come through in terms of the funding proposal. Again, there's not a lot more that could be done with that. But when you look at the structure of the COP, it's not quite as bad as you might think it is, because the other thing I should mention, some of these negotiators have come to all of the COPs. They all know each other incredibly well. And they sit down and have coffee, and a lot happens in those discussions. And so there are elements that are supportive of taking a more coherent approach to the challenges faced in different regions than just looking strictly at national borders.
Great, thank you both. Let's go to Allie and then Dave.
Thanks, Ben. So we're hearing more and more from parents and kids about the experience of eco-anxiety that is in part related to recent IPCC findings, more and more natural disasters being covered in the media, and the like. And I was just wondering if you all would mind sharing some concrete takeaways from COP26 that could address this growing anxiety specifically for non-research populations.
Who wants to start?
Go for it, Deb.
As an educator, I got lots of resources to lay on you for that one. So there's 2 things that are just general. First of all, talkclimate.org has developmentally appropriate research grounded resources. It's out of Seattle College in Washington State. Heather Price, excellent work, really helpful. Resources for adults too, because we all have it too. We have a STEM teaching tool on eco-anxiety that we produce, so stemteachingtools.org, and if you type in eco-anxiety, that'll get you it as well. And then the last one I would say is there's a really fabulous feminist intersectional justice project called All We Can Save. And it's a book, but it's also All We Can Save Circles. And they did a collaborative project with Generation Dread to produce a series of resources on emotions and climate and despair. So they're all extremely helpful resources. Having said that, out of COP, I get asked this question almost every time I talk to somebody, and I actually live in a state of hope. And it's not that I don't think that the world is burning and that I can't see the data. I look at it all the time, almost every day. But what I see is that every one of us has agency in the spheres in which we work, not individual. I actually think individual action is something we have to push back on that causes despair, as collective action and empowerment. And so we have a lot of agency in our organizations, our schools, and our families, and in all different ways, our churches, and we need to just work and talk together. So the talkclimate.org resources help us with that, to think about what it is that we're going to do next in our places, in our locals. And we have a lot of ability to interact. Of course, we want the giant corporations to also do their piece because they contribute a lot. But, that's part of what we might be able to influence in different spheres.
Great, thanks.
And
Deb.
I'll add to that youth have been showing up at COPs for the 20 years I've been going to COPs. So there's always sessions that highlight youth. That's been a constant theme throughout. And when you think about what informs the negotiations, for the first time several years ago, the COP actually asked the IPCC to produce that special report on warming of 1.5 degrees. And that had a huge impact. And one of the issues that we would like to have covered in the report was issues around mental health, but there's not enough literature. And this is an area that we as a research community need to look at because it is of high concern. It was one of the 10 new insights in climate science that were released at the COP. All of this influences the negotiations. So the more research that we have to support what needs to be done, the more influence we're going to have on the negotiations in this and in every other issue.
The other thing I would add on that is also, first of all, education is incredibly important, and knowledge is power, and empowering yourself with learning about it is really important. But more so is getting involved, and I think that goes to the youth activism that has already been touched upon. But that's I think part of that anxiety comes from this sense of hopelessness and enormity of the problem, and how does one individual or one small group make a difference. And I think when you get involved in these organizations like Deb was describing, it's not about individual actions, but when you really get involved in a movement, it's extraordinarily empowering and encouraging. And you can look at Greta Thunberg's own mental health journey, and she's talked about that very candidly. And when you watch her now, she really looks happy with and encouraged by what she's doing, and it's been extraordinarily powerful what she's doing. And I think that getting engaged, whether it's through school strike or through your church or through some local environmental organization or through your university, there are many ways to engage in it, or through EarthLab, that will help with that sense of doing something. And I think that's really important for all of our mental health, to feel like we can contribute.
And Maya, one thing I suggest to my students is here in King County, every other year there's Green Globe Awards. And go look at those. They are so inspiring. It's a dozen to 20 individuals or organizations. And it's a great place to start. And you can see what wonderful things that have been done when these things occur. And obviously there's lots more organizations, but that's a real specific place that students can go look and find places to volunteer at, because it is important to do that.
I just got a notification from Christina Kwok, who's at Brookings Institute, that her and some colleagues with Plan International and Unbounded Associates collaborated with youth around the world to produce a youth leadership in climate policy workbook as well. So maybe we can share these different resources with EarthLab and post them related to this session, because I think that was a brand new guide to think about climate empowerment with youth.
Great idea. And thanks for sharing those tips. It is so important for us to remember where the opportunities for action are and how big the community of people are that are working on these issues. Dave, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I was excited to read about the attendance and recognition of Indigenous people and tribal nations, including Fawn Sharp of the Quinault Indian Nation. But I was also struck by the large presence of fossil fuel representatives. And so I'm wondering if you all can share some thoughts. What should we take away from the composition of attendees and participants, how they're engaged, and how that's shifted over time?
It's a really good question. It's, as I said, you have to be on a delegation to get in. You can't just show up. And at the moment, the University of Washington gets 3 slots at the COP. And so one way to increase that is to every year have larger numbers of people, and they're likely to be rejected, but the more we push, the bigger the delegation we're going to be able to get. And that is going to be a strategy that we can use as a university to have more input over time. In terms of some of the local and indigenous knowledge, I was really impressed. I had a leadership role in the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. And there was an organization that pulled together a meeting with a little bit of support from the IPCC to summarize all of the literature on local and indigenous knowledge. And that review took quite an effort on the part of this organization and was provided to all the authors. And that went in throughout the 5th assessment report because we made sure that the authors did so. So finding ways to organize different groups to make sure that authors in the IPCC or in the National Climate Assessment have the literature to be able to come up with assessment statements that then go up to decision makers at federal agencies or to countries.
Yeah, I would add one other thing. And so while civil society has limited badges, states don't. There was some limitations this year because of the COVID protocols related to state parties, but generally speaking, states don't have limits on the number of people that they can bring. So we should be pushing our officials in every location possible to badge their Indigenous participants, because their Indigenous participants should be state badged. And so like that would be one thing that I would advocate hard for. And there is like global efforts to do that. It's going to be differential, like in different places, because not all nations want to even recognize their Indigenous peoples. So in those situations, then we should be working with global civil society organizations, things like CAN International, Climate Action Network International, or other like Indigenous Alliances International to badge those folks that can't get badged in their own states. That would be my like strategic move. And the way to like push on that for us as a university is actually like write op-eds, use our power and privilege to be able to name that and state that that is actually a need. And that decision is made by August. And actually to what Kristie was saying earlier in terms of the SB participation, which is even more critical actually. Those decisions are made in like April or maybe even March.
The only other thing I'd add is the good thing was I can't speak to how this has trended through time, but when this data came out in Britain about the fossil fuel representatives and that they were the largest number, it was a big scandal. And so I think keeping that data open, and I think it was an NGO that actually plowed through the delegate data to produce it and to put a spotlight on this. And so again, people felt very uncomfortable about that. And I think that's really good. That's really healthy. And so at least it was a scandal, and hopefully it will continue to get better. And the sort of things that Deb was talking about would really help with that too.
For sure, for sure. Jeff, we might have time for the one last question before we offer our panelists a closing thought of what's giving them hope for the
Constance has had her hand up for a while, so.
Oh, that's okay. I'm a co-host. I can wait. You go, Jeff.
I just wanted to pick up on this conversation on Indigenous populations and First Nations. And in particular, I'm mindful the context is COP, so I'm delighted at all the conversation. But I'm equally mindful that some of this begins at home. And the United States in recent years has done a comprehensive review of reservations and Native American lands and who ought to have what voice and how those are managed. And in a parallel but entirely distinct universe, did a review of public lands in which there were literally no references to, I mean, there's one in the entire report, references to the role that Native Americans might have in shaping and influencing our policies on our public lands that are outside of reservations. And so just completely ignoring thousands of years of knowledge and treating it as though these were two entirely discrete geoecologies in event. So amen to the various comments made on how we could be strategic as a university, but with our first ever tribal regent and with on the cusp of a new tribal liaison, we as a university could help lift the game by first pushing within the state and then across the nation, and then making sure that the US delegation is much more representative of Native voices.
Yeah, and Jeff, just to build on that too, like, just to be clear, UNDRIP, so the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, like, it says that basically consent is needed to be able to engage and work. And consent is not consultation. Consent is like at the table, equitable decision-making practices with different knowledge streams and science traditions in play and understanding that. And right now I'm here in New Orleans at the American Geophysical Union meeting, and it is fascinating that I am hearing these really deep threads now. Even here in America, in AGU, they have the first time that they're having an Indigenous caucus, like organizing and thinking about the meeting, understanding what that means, bringing in strands of that history and tradition of science into the work. It's really, really encouraging. They had Dr. Robert Bullard from, sorry, he's calling him Dr. Bullard of, from Southern Texas, and like all of the work in the cancer corridors and environmental health and justice. And so like those types of moves are happening in the world, and that's where I would be hopeful. So that's going to be my hope moment, that those things are actually being lifted.
Great comment. So Constance, you've been waiting patiently. We have a few more minutes, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. Do you have a question you want to jump in here, or should we move to the last comment from each of our panelists about what gave them hope?
I think a last comment about hope would be a wonderful way to wrap this up. Thank you.
All right. Maya, can I start with you, please?
I sort of summarized it before, but really the young people, the energy in the young people, the protests associated with that, the increasing recognition of the importance of voices and inclusion of Indigenous people, the increasing recognition of the importance of environmental justice, and yeah, the sense that progress is being made, even if it's slow. It's going in the right direction.
Great. Chris?
At the moment, the budget under the Biden administration gives me a lot of hope. We all know how much research needs to be done, and we have a responsibility as a university. We are unique across the US in terms of the breadth and depth of our expertise, and facilitating under EarthLab ways for us to come together to go after some of the big questions that need to be addressed. And really looking forward to working with anyone who's interested in engaging on these issues so that we can start providing the science that will further the incentive to make a difference.
Great. Deb, did you want to add any more to your comment of hope, or were you?
Yeah, I think I'll add one last thought. So I have seen more this year than any other year, and maybe it's because we all had time to sit and actually think deeply for the last couple of years. Diverse axiological and epistemological traditions coming into conversation with each other. So like we're actually starting to think that other worldviews might be the way to work out of this problem that we've worked into with a particular worldview. And so the idea that we're actually speaking across historically siloed and almost erased and, genocidal kind of situations, like that we're actually doing that and understanding that we need to be in community with each other more deeply, that's really a hopeful thing for me. And that people are doing it. I went to a breakfast there with business leaders, Indigenous women leaders from all across Africa, and academics, and we're all in conversation together about like what can we do and how can we do it better around food sovereignty issues. So really hopeful.
Great. Thank you all for sharing the inspiration. And I'm going to offer you the last word here, my co-host Jeff, before we say goodbye and hand it off.
Again, I just want to thank our 3 representatives at COP26. You've done us incredibly proud, as several of you have done in the past, but also to repeat both several of their comments about how we can increase the size of the delegation by having more of the people in our audience pressing my office for, yes, we want to be on the delegation so that we can, flood COPs of the future and the related meetings with requests for larger delegations, and hope that over time they will recognize the importance of the larger and more inclusive delegation. But for anyone who's listening and wants to know more about how to sort of plug into this, because it's been too long a sort of hidden gem of the University of Washington, and so making it more visible is part of what my office is committed to doing in partnership with EarthLab, but also being more strategic about how we build our delegations to be most impactful.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for joining us. Constance, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much to our panelists for your time today in this very busy time of year. And thank you to our audience members for being here today. We had 40 RSVPs and over 40 people attend. So I love that ratio. That just shows the interest that people have for this topic. And as Jeff said, if you have any interest in collaborating with OGA, please reach out to him or his office. If you're interested in working with EarthLab, you're welcome to reach out to me or Ben directly. We're always looking to collaborate across sectors, disciplines, across all of our campuses to work towards solving this issue of our climate change, and really at the intersection of climate and social justice. So this was our last event of the year. We look forward to hosting a lot of events in winter quarter. So we hope to see you all next year, and I hope that everyone has a healthy and joyous winter break. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for the honor to represent the university. It's great to be involved in this way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.